Hi, my amazing students and John, just to go through assignment very, very quickly. So when we look at Timu, we see the three questions. The first one, key barriers and risks that we face in terms of Africa expansion. If you could please go to Learning Unit 2, it is slide 44. And if we look at those very rapidly, geopolitical concerns, those are the realities of doing business in Africa. I think we know that we have wars that break out, we have corrupt governments, we have a belief that the only way things get done is when you pay some form of bribe. My apologies for the dog outside. It's the third attempt. I'm not going to stop again because of external interruptions. The second one, the risks of bringing capital into a country where we have issues around politics. And as I said, there is a belief in some countries in Africa that the only way you do business is by paying people off. And all of those risks have to be assessed, because where do you hide the money in terms of your books for paying some sort of facilitation fee, i.e., corruption in terms of making sure you get things done. The third one there, government policy. I think the uncertainties there relate often in Africa to this constant notion that we might actually be faced with some form of nationalization where assets are simply taken over by government. And yeah, we also need to understand that there are some licensing issues. To go back to my previous point, I think the reality is that you don't get licenses unless you pay some sort of bribe, or at least that is the perception. So you can't do business without having to break some form of ethical code and hand over some money to somebody who is essentially less than perfect. Guys, and then commercial default. I think, suppliers not paying you, taking suppliers to court, all of those are very, very real issues when the courts are not going to side with the right of a person to actually claim money that is owed to them. And then infrastructural issues, everything from transport to whether it's rail, whether it's road, whether we can get to certain and through certain terrain because of roads, etc. All of those are issues that have to be considered. And then you can see the kind of macroeconomic instability where we see significant volatility in exchange rates, for example, where we see issues around social unrest. Remember the pestle factors, the S in the pestle. I think in terms of South Africa, we see the kind of protests in terms of service delivery all the time, and those kinds of protests almost take on the form of a mini revolution each time. And then just other concerns, access to trade facilities. We know what's happened in terms of Durban's ports, where there is a serious backlog. So the idea of importing and just having your items sit at a harbor, so and the initial outlay happening and having to then find ways of balancing your funds because you can't sell the items. And then just susceptibility to natural disasters. Again, we see flooding that should have been or could have been prevented. We have significant issues in terms of climate change in Africa. The other one is the level of uninsurability of your risks. We see now that because of the change in the world, that insurers will not insure every single aspect of an organization's business, and will often isolate certain aspects as being too risky to insure. So we live in the society where we have significant insurance risk. And then lastly, the managerial bias. I think that often there is this expectation that you will appoint local people at a certain level, and then the headaches around that. And I think we also have seen that really global MNCs, the kind of brands that are very recognizable, are not always popular across developing nations. The belief that they're not giving local companies an opportunity to develop. So have a glance at that. I'm pretty sure somebody will share the page numbers, but that is Learning Unit 2, slide 44 and 45. What I'll do is I will create an extra set of slides just around this assignment and share those with you. The second question then, the idea of transfer pricing, to go to Learning Unit 3, and we are looking at slide 37, 38, and 39. I think that's about it. In terms of transfer pricing, I think this is what organizations do in terms of payment and moving resources between different subsidiaries in a broader multinational. So it is how we move and how we pay for resources that are transferred from different outlets in different countries. And what will often happen is that multinationals will make sure that they have a significant tax saving. So instead of claiming or having the money paid as tax in a country with a high tax bracket, what will happen is that the profits are transferred internally to a country where the tax brackets are lower. That's one form of suggestion that there is this kind of tax evasion associated with transfer pricing. So it's the movement of money and it's the movement of resources between different subsidiaries, between subsidiary and the head office in the home country where obviously the multinational operates from. I think there's several issues in terms of fraud being suggested. I think when you take your profits back to the home country, essentially the host nation where the money is actually made will not benefit from the tax payment because the profits have been transferred to wherever the head office is. And obviously you would then, in terms of that head office, pay taxes on it. It has all to do with the marginal rate of tax in a particular country. When we look at transferring in internal sources, what will happen is that you inflate your prices so that the operating costs in a country go higher because of the inflated prices, and therefore can have a bigger write-off in terms of their tax obligations. So your operating costs increase, and simply just because of the transfer of the resources at a significantly higher price, your production gets more expensive, therefore your tax liability reduces. And then just other advantages. So here it's about your tax liability. We can also see that money can be moved away from a country where we expect a devaluation of a currency simply to try and mitigate the loss in that country. So you move the money before the actual currency devalues to another country where the currency is a lot stronger, essentially making sure that I'm going to use the word very carefully, manipulate the exchange rate. Okay, and then lastly, guys, also moved away from subsidiaries to a tax haven. So essentially, you have all the subsidiaries work together as part of the head office. Their earnings go to the head office in a country where there is a significantly lower requirement from a tax perspective. And what will happen then is essentially the host nation's tax burden is reduced significantly. I hope that makes sense. I have this picture. We'll discuss that in class. And then the next one, guys, is here. Fluctuating foreign currency rates. I think we understand that currencies are highly volatile, and we've seen, in particular over the last number of years, the volatility in terms of the South African rand and how it's yo-yoed in terms of its value, and obviously have become very, very weak in relation to those stronger traditional currencies. So the previous one, guys, is Learning Unit 3, slides 37, 38, 39. I will set up a separate set of slides for this assignment. And then in the next one is slide 49. I think it's 49 to 51. So, in terms of mitigating the risks associated with those kinds of currency fluctuations, the first one is to consider the different exposures and trying to figure out what we can do to mitigate the impact of those. The first one is transactional exposure, where we look at money that is still owed in terms of suppliers, for example. Now, if you are importing to South Africa, you are going to pay a significant amount in terms of the additional payment because of the weak currency. So what we see will happen is we have to realize that if we import certain items, those items might get very expensive simply because of currency exchanges. So there are a number of ways to deal with it, and we'll talk about that. But often it is to try and pay at the time and pay in advance when the currency is low so that you mitigate the risk of that currency fluctuating. The other side of the coin is if your currency all of a sudden gets stronger, you've paid too much for the items. The second one, translation exposure. Yeah, I think it is about the loss of the value of the organization in terms of accountancy processes. I think when you are in a country and you look at the cost of the operations of a particular subsidiary, I think if the currency appreciates, depreciates, running a particular subsidiary and a production line in a different country could become significantly more expensive or could become cheaper depending on the fluctuation of the currency. And then economic exposure. And this is the real one that companies are often more concerned about. I think it is about the value of the organization in terms of the bigger picture. So you'll have a home office, which will be the original multinational where it was established, and you'll have subsidiaries across the globe, and each of those subsidiaries would have a certain value in relation to the headquarters. In terms of the head office, if a country's currency gets significantly weaker, the value of that operation in that country will reduce significantly in terms of its economic value to the organization. And I think it is anything from political upheaval to Trump saying nonsense that will often reduce or increase the value of operations in a particular nation, simply because the currency has got a lot weaker. Right. Yeah, and you can see just a bit of a summary here, guys. Don't know. I think the truth is that if you are an international finance manager, you are often very aware of what is happening in the world from a strategic perspective. You are often aware about currencies potentially getting stronger and weaker. And it's that balance of trying to make sure that you pay and receive and that you place your outlets in countries where you have a more stable currency. And it's about making sure that we are constantly taking decisions and updating decisions in terms of currency fluctuation. Um, yeah, and you can see some of the suggestions. I don't know whether this is the question. Let me have a glance at it quickly. Okay, yeah, no, it is not the question, but yeah, we'll look at this together in class. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Let me stop this recording.